That's the first time I've seen the bell choir sweat during their, man, they got a workout today, didn't they? So there's an old cartoon that shows St. Peter standing at the pearly gates, and it's that classic drawing of St. Peter behind his desk, and he's got that big book open in front of him, and he's got a quill in hand, and he's looking out over this group of new arrivals at Heaven's Gate, and he addresses them with these words. He says, "Welcome. You are now exempt from all federal, state, and local taxes." Yeah, that's one thing to look forward to. I think it was Ben Franklin who said that there are two certainties in life: death and taxes. But ultimately, eventually, many of us learn that there's a third certainty in life, and that's suffering. Over the years, I've had great opportunities to develop friendships and with missionaries who served in different areas of Africa. And I had to think about this. It was actually 5 years ago already that there were a group of us getting ready to go to Sierra Leone and visit for the dedication of the Tayama Enterprise Academy. But what a great learning experience it was to learn from people who live in a very different culture and very different circumstances than I live in. And this is just a statement of reality, but for many Africans, they openly laugh at what we Americans think is really important or where we place our priorities. So under that vein, truth being stranger than fiction, I came across a list of actual complaints that were reported to the customer service department of a chain of vacation resorts. Somebody actually complained that the beach was too sandy. We had to clean everything when we returned to the room. Somebody who obviously has never been around water said, "No one told us there would be fish in the water. The children were scared." This is not from somebody in America, but it took us 9 hours to fly home from Jamaica to England, and it only took our American friends 3 hours to get home. That seems unfair. Physics isn't fair. I like this one. "I was bitten by a mosquito. The brochure didn't mention mosquitoes." Now, let's be honest about it. You're thinking about the people in your life who would register these complaints? Or this one? We had to line up outside to board the boat, and there was no air conditioning. Today, we take a deeper dive in one of the more intriguing and difficult books of the Bible, the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is exactly what you think it is. It's a book of laments. That's where that word comes from. It was written by the prophet Jeremiah, the same Jeremiah whose name is in the Old Testament book. It's a collection of 5 funeral poems. And it's really the outpouring of his personal grief over the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian army. And in particular, Lamentations 4 is Jeremiah's lament. And what we find when we read through this, and maybe you found it difficult to listen to, but Lamentations 4 presents for us a very different perspective of God, a different view of the God that we prefer, especially we Americans prefer. Jeremiah is reflecting on the suffering of the people that he dearly loves. Think about on this day, when a child suffers, the lament of a parent, a good father or a good mother. You see, many of us have experienced this. If you go back and read that, everyone is impacted. No one is left out. Jeremiah laments the suffering and starvation of the poor, as well as the rich. And as much as we don't always like to think about this or verbalize it, everyone goes through suffering. No one is exempt from this. However, what we find is that Jeremiah is not afraid to point out the causes of the suffering. In particular, the sins of the so-called prophets and the priests. Now, this is not a political statement by any means, but plenty of studies show, and through personal experiences I mentioned, that we Americans, North Americans, have a very different perspective of who God is and how God works than the rest of the world. And the God presented in Lamentations is very different from the God that we Americans prefer. The primary theme, as I mentioned, of Lamentations is suffering. And for many of us civilized North Americans today, suffering does not fit neatly into our concept of who God is or who we want God to be. After all, we're told if God really is good, if God really is loving, then why do people suffer? That's one of the most common questions. There was one famous athlete recently. She's a self-professed atheist, but she shared that her career-ending injury is, quote, proof positive that God doesn't exist. One of my favorite writers, C.S. Lewis, wrote that we often prefer to think of God as an indulgent grandfather who wants all the children to have a good time. Dr. Larry Crabb, one of my other favorite writers, he writes that particularly in America, we have bought into the God is here to bless me with a good life gospel more than we realize or want to admit. And so, as I found myself thinking of my mother a lot as I wrote, because I can hear her saying this next line. Maybe she was the one who fed it to me. And so maybe a good place to begin is to stop pretending that our individual suffering is something unique or a sign of God's contempt or absence. Your suffering may be new to you, but in the wider scope of time and space, what we find is that suffering is a fact of life, and whether we'd like to admit it or not, testing is the nature of God. But here, Dr. Larry Crabb writes something graciously insightful. He writes, every moment of suffering represents a strident but merciful call to repent. And every moment of suffering presents a painful opportunity to hope. So perhaps the message of Lamentations is not that sometimes life stinks, but the message of Lamentations is more gracious, more life-giving. And that's this, that something good happens in suffering that cannot happen in pleasure. What we find time and time again is that the true measure of faith in Jesus Christ is not in how we endure suffering, but in how we react in the midst of suffering. Now, there are three sayings that you may be familiar with, and all three of these sayings are attributed to ancient Chinese culture. The first is, may you come to the attention of those in authority. The second is, may the gods give you everything you ask for. And the third is this, may you live in interesting times. Now, here's the rub. All three of these are meant to be curses. Oh, yeah? Well, may you live in interesting times. Oh, yeah? Well, may you come to the attention of those in authority. Could it be that in our times of suffering is not a curse, but a great opportunity? Interesting times are not unique. Every generation goes through its own definition of interesting times. But when we look back on history, we find that time and time again, there are periods of confusion and pain. And in every time, it is the church that was a force for God's truth. In the days after the Roman Empire fell, that was referred to as the migration period or the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages aptly refers to the turmoil and the confusion that defined life for so many for almost 500 years. During the Dark Ages, chaos was the order of the day. Factions were common. Barbaric war broke out, and an entire continent and culture seemed to be slipping away. Doesn't that sound familiar? But it was during the Dark Ages. There was a force that brought meaning and order, providing light in the darkness. And that's the church. In a classic case study for our times, the medieval church was countercultural. As the chaos spread, it was the church that planted thousands of mission houses all across Europe. What made the church during this time countercultural was the discipline and creativity and order and purpose that was lacking in the culture around them. It was the Christian church that opened schools and shelters for orphans and widows and the poor. It was the Christian church that was at the forefront of establishing hospitals and farms and new roads and bridges. It's interesting that during that time, people outside the church were not drawn in so much by the hospitality or compassion, but by the discipline and compassion and dedication of Christians. During the Dark Ages, the Christian church held true to the basics of civilized society: faith in Jesus Christ, education, and a common civility for all. The Christian church brought light into the darkness of the age. And eventually what happened was Europe emerged from the Dark Ages into a renewed time of cultural creativity and education and art. And so we do find indeed that something good happens in suffering that cannot happen in pleasure. The early years of our own nation's history were challenging. But again, it was the Christian church that was again at the front lines of health and education and welfare. 100 of the first 110 universities established in the New World were Christian institutions. It was during interesting times that Jesus sat with his disciples. They gathered for a Passover meal in the upper room. And Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen in the next 24 hours. And what was going to happen would rock the world, not only of the disciples, but rock the world. And perhaps, I wonder if Jesus was thinking about the dark ages to come, and even the dark ages of our time, when he said to his disciples, "The hour is coming when you will be scattered, each one of you to his home, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone," Jesus said, "because the Father is with me. I have said these things to you," Jesus said, "so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution. But take heart, take courage." Jesus said, "I have conquered the world." Indeed, something good happens in suffering that cannot happen in pleasure. It was during another interesting time, a dark and confusing time, when the Israelites were living in exile and shaking their fists at God. And the same Jeremiah who wrote the 5 poems of lament heard God speak these words of hope. He said, "I will fulfill in you my promise, for surely I know the plans I have for you, plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope." It was George Orwell, if you remember him, who hauntingly captured the essence of our times when he wrote in his book 1984, "Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbors, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling filled the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult." It is in dark times, it is in times of social upheaval and confusion, the interesting times that we find ourselves living in, that calls us back to the mission communities of our history. And like the mission communities of the past, this is the time for the church to rise, to be the voice in the wilderness of truth, of compassion, of civility. For surely something good happens in suffering that cannot happen in pleasure. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for Holy Communion.